Hello, at 1,000 subscribers, I will make a special series of stories for you. The storm came in sudden and mean, like most things in the high country. All day the sky had been a bruised color, and by late afternoon, the wind funneled down from the Sierra peaks, dragging sleet and grit in its teeth. Ezekiel Zeke Harrow kept his head low as he followed the wagon-rutted trail toward Red Mesa. His boots were stiff with thawed and frozen mud, and his deerskin coat was crusted with the smoke of a dozen campfires. A man could live most of a year in the mountains without touching a town, and Zeke had nearly done it. 5 months of trapping along the high creeks, sleeping under pine boughs, eating what he caught or shot. The only reason he came down now was to trade pelts for powder, coffee, and the strongest whiskey they sold in that dusty basin of a town. He'd been rehearsing the quiet of it in his head walk to the trading post. Swap the furs, get a bottle, maybe one hot meal, and leave before the stink of people got under his skin. But trouble has a way of sniffing out men who want no part of it. He heard it before he saw it, a churning murmur of voices, sharper than the wind's howl. As he turned onto Pike Street, the crowd came into view. 20, maybe 30 townsfolk clumped together, all staring upward toward the slanted roof of the Silver Spur Saloon. Their faces were tight and pale, hats clutched to their chests against the gusts. Zeke slowed, his eyes climbing the front of the saloon until they reached the source. A woman hung there, suspended from the ridge beam like some cruel weather flag, her head lolled to one side, golden hair whipping in the wind. Her wrists were bound above her, lashed to the wooden crosspiece, and the skirt of her faded calico dress was plastered to her legs by sleet. Even from the street, Zeke could see. Her skin pale as milk marred by something dark over her right shoulder. He stepped closer, ignoring the hiss of the wind through his teeth. It wasn't dirt. It wasn't ink. It was a brand. The letters were burned deep, puckered, and ugly, black against the white of her flesh. 2 words. Apache lover. Zeke's stomach knotted. The kind of knot a man gets when he sees something that doesn't belong in the order of the world. He'd seen cattle branded, horses too, but never a human being. Not outside of nightmares. No one moved to climb up to her. The sheriff, a stocky man with a badge tarnished from more years than polish, stood back from the crowd, jaw tight but eyes unsure. "Storm's comin' in harder," he called to nobody in particular. "Best wait till it passes." Zeke spat into the muddy street. She'd be dead before that. The sheriff blinked, like the idea hadn't occurred to him. A ladder leaned against the blacksmith's wall 2 doors down. Zeke grabbed it without asking, ignoring the mutters from the townsfolk. The rungs were slick with ice, but his hands scarred from years of climbing rock and hauling. Traps held steady. The wind nearly shoved him backward when he reached the roofline. The woman's head rolled toward him, her lips blue, eyes half closed. He hooked an arm around the ridge pole, cutting the rope with his skinning knife. She slumped forward into him light, too light, like a body that hadn't eaten right for weeks. He pressed his fingers to her neck. Pulse, weak but alive. The climb down was harder with her draped over his shoulder, the ladder swaying in the gale. By the time his boots hit the mud, the crowd had gone silent, all eyes fixed on the stranger from the mountains carrying the branded woman. Like a sack of precious freight, Zeke looked to the sheriff. "Get a fire going," he said, his voice rough from weeks without use, "and boil water." The lawman hesitated, but the look in Zeke's eyes must have carried the weight of the high country, because he nodded and motioned toward the saloon. Doors. They laid her out on the billiard table inside, lanterns casting yellow light that quivered with the wind pressing at the walls. Zeke stripped off his coat and tucked it around her, feeling the fever heat beneath the chill of her skin. The townsfolk pressed in close, whispering questions, but Zeke ignored them. His eyes kept going back to that scar, the ugly black words. That told a story no one here seemed ready to speak aloud. Somewhere deep in the storm's roar, Zeke thought he could already hear trouble-coming hoofbeats, maybe, or just the memory of them. Either way, he knew the quiet visit he'd planned to Red Mesa was gone. The wind battered Red Mesa all through the night, rattling shutters and whistling through every crack in the buildings. Inside the Silver Spur saloon, the warmth from the big potbelly stove fought against the drafts, though the air still tasted of smoke, whiskey, and the wet wool of coats hung near the door. Zeke sat beside the billiard table, one elbow on his knee, his chair tilted forward so he could keep watch on the woman. She lay wrapped in a quilt someone had fetched from upstairs, her breathing ragged but steady. A kerosene lantern sat on the floor by his boot, throwing long shadows up the wall. The words burned into her shoulder. Apache lover seemed to twitch. With each flicker of the flame, the sheriff had drifted off hours ago, muttering something about better sense in the morning. The townsfolk had left too, their curiosity dampened by cold and darkness. Only old Nate, the barkeep, remained awake, polishing glasses with the kind of distracted repetition a man uses when he's avoiding a subject. "Brand like that, Nate," said at last, voice low. "Ain't for warning. Ain't for punishment neither. It's for making sure she never forgets where she's been, or who she's been with." Zeke didn't answer. He'd learned a long time ago that words didn't fill silence half as well as they spoiled it. A sudden gasp from the table snapped his attention back. Her eyes flew open wide, wild, not sure of the room she was in. She twisted, trying to push herself up, and Zeke caught her shoulders gently but firmly. "You're safe," he said. "Storm's outside. You're inside. That's all that matters." For now, she stilled, chest rising fast. Then, in a voice hoarse from thirst, she said, "Where's Quixote? Where's my boy?" Zeke frowned. "Don't know those names. I found you on a roof, near froze to death." Her lips trembled. "They took him, they took our son. Quixote tried to fight." Her words dissolved into a cough. Zeke poured a tin cup of water from the kettle on the stove and held it to her lips. She drank greedily, wiping her mouth with the back of a shaking hand. It took a while for the rest to come out, but once it did, it poured like a flash flood in summer. Her name was Claire Whitcomb. 3 years ago, her father's freight business went under, leaving her stranded in El Paso. A stage headed west was her only chance, but somewhere past the Jornada del Muerto, it was attacked. She swore it wasn't Apaches they came later. The first raiders were white men, masked, who scattered when a Mescalero Apache warrior drove them off. His name was Quixote. He'd taken her to his people, treated her injuries, and in time she stayed. "I didn't belong anywhere else," she said, eyes fixed on the wood grain of the table. "With him I did. 2 years of peace in the high desert, raising their boy, learning the language, the ways of the land. But last week, riders came at dawn. They wore war paint, but the cut of their saddles and the brand on their horses were wrong. Claire said she recognized one of them, a ranch hand from the Bari spread north of here. They killed the dogs, set fire to the drying racks," she whispered. "They beat me. They burned me with this name. Then they took my boy." Zeke leaned back in his chair, the wood creaking. He knew of the Bari New. Its owner liked to hire men who could shoot straight and keep their mouths shut. He also knew the distance between the law's reach and a man's sense of justice was a canyon with no bridge. "Sheriff know all this?" Zeke asked. Claire's eyes were flat. "He's the one told me to forget it. Said the Bari runs half the cattle in this territory. Said a woman like me wouldn't stand a chance in court." Her voice broke, but she kept speaking. "I told him I'd take a chance. That's when someone grabbed me from behind. Next thing I knew, I was on that roof. Zeke didn't have to ask why they'd put her there. It was a message. Leave things be, or worse would come. The stove popped and hissed. Outside, the wind carried the faint clatter of a loose shutter somewhere down the street. Zeke studied her face-sharp cheekbones under the dirt, eyes that had seen more than most men he knew. You still want that chance? He asked, her gaze met his, steady now. I want my boy back. Zeke nodded once. Then we start in the morning. Old Nate stopped polishing and stared. Harrow, you're staring a hornet's nest. That ranch has got a dozen hired guns, all mean, all looking for a fight. Zeke stood, pulling on his coat. I've seen hornets, he said, adjusting his hat. These sound more like flies. Claire almost smiled at that. Almost. The storm was still howling when Zeke settled in a chair by the door, rifle across his knees. He didn't plan on sleeping. Somewhere out in that dark, men were counting on fear to keep their quarry cornered. But Zeke Harrow had never been much good at being afraid. The morning broke cold and pale, the kind of light that makes the desert look like the bones of something long dead. Red Mesa was still waking as Zeke led his mule from the livery, saddlebags loaded with cartridges, jerky, and a canteen. Claire stood beside him, her hair damp from a quick wash, wearing a patched riding skirt and a borrowed coat that hung too loose on her frame. Her eyes looked older than her face. You ride? Zeke asked. She nodded. Keo taught me. I can keep up. They rode out without a word to the sheriff. Zeke figured the less the lawman knew, the better. The tracks of several horses were easy to pick up, deep prints heading northeast toward the Box Canyons. The wind had done little to fill them overnight. By noon, the sun was bright and hard, throwing heat off the rock faces, but the wind stayed cool. Claire spoke little, though she occasionally raised a hand to shade her eyes and scan the horizon. Once she pointed to a lone juniper, twisted by the wind. We camped there once, she said. Keo told me the tree was older than any of us would ever be. Zeke didn't answer. He was watching the trail. They found the first sign of the riders' camp on the second day, a blackened fire pit, still warm beneath the ash. Zeke crouched, sifting through it with a stick. A strip of cloth lay half buried in the dirt. He pulled it free, holding it up for Claire to see. It was a piece of a child's shirt. Claire's lips tightened, but she didn't cry. We're close, she said. That night, they camped in a shallow arroyo. The stars spilled across the sky, in cold clusters, and the moon painted the rocks silver. Zeke kept the fire small and low, more for warmth than light. Claire sat across from him, her knees pulled to her chest. When we find them, she said quietly, I want to be the one who ends it. Zeke poked at the fire, watching the sparks crawl upward. Men like that don't die easy. You sure you can live with it? She looked at him through the wavering heat. I've already been living with worse. Before dawn, they broke camp. By mid-morning, Zeke spotted movement ahead, a flash of sunlight on metal, the bob of a hat brim over a ridge. He dismounted, signaling for Claire to do the same. They led the horses into a dry wash, heaping low. From the ridge, they had a view of the creek bottom below. 5 men lounged near the water, their rifles propped against saddles. One of them, broad shoulders, black hat, wore the Bar E brand on his vest. Zeke counted 2 others he recognized from the stories told in Red Mesa Hard Men, quick with a trigger and slower with a conscience. In the shadow of a mesquite, a small tent stood apart from the fire. A faint movement stirred the canvas. Zeke didn't need to ask who it was. Claire's hand went to the revolver on her hip. They'll kill us both if we go down there head on, Zeke said. We'll use the rocks for cover. I'll take the ones at the fire. You circle to the tent. She nodded once. The first shot cracked like a whip in the dry air. Zeke's Sharp's rifle sent the man in the black hat sprawling backward into the dust. Before the others could grab their guns, Claire was already moving along the edge of the creek bed, low and fast. A second shot from Zeke dropped another, and then the camp exploded into shouting. Two of the ranch hands dove behind their horses, firing blindly toward the rocks. Zeke's next round punched through the side of a saddle and into the man crouched behind it. Claire reached the tent, pulling the flap open. A small boy tumbled into her arms, barefoot and wide-eyed. She spun, firing twice at the man rushing her from the fire. One shot took him in the chest, the other in the throat. He fell hard, choking on dust. The last ranch hand tried to run for his horse, but Zeke was faster. His rifle boomed one final time, and the man crumpled. The silence afterward was heavy, broken only by the creek's trickle and the boy's soft, frightened breaths. Claire held him close, murmuring in a mix of English and Apache. Zeke walked down from the rocks, his rifle hanging loose in his hand. He looked over the bodies, checking for signs of life. There were none. "You all right?" he asked her. She nodded, though her voice shook when she said, "He's safe now." Zeke scanned the horizon. "Not yet. Word'll travel fast. We need to be gone before more come looking." They saddled the boy onto Claire's horse, and by the time the sun began its slow drop behind the mesas, the creek bed was empty again save for 5 still bodies cooling in the dust. They rode hard through the canyon country, shadows stretching long ahead of them as the sun sank toward the serrated line of mesas. The boy clung to Claire's waist, his small fingers gripping the folds of her coat. Zeke kept a steady pace beside them, rifle across his saddle horn, eyes scanning the ridgelines for movement. Behind them, the creek bed and its 5 dead men were already falling into the silence of the desert. Coyotes would find them before sunrise. By the second day's ride, the weather shifted. Thin clouds bled across the sky, muting the sun, and the wind carried the smell of rain. They kept off the main trails, moving through arroyos and dry washes, the kind of routes only a man who'd lived long in the backcountry would know. Zeke stopped often to check the ground for sign. Twice he found it fresh prints, a horse with a cracked shoe. Someone was following, but not close enough yet to press them. On the third morning, they reached the edge of Red Mesa. The town stirred in the cool dawn smoke curling from chimneys, the clang of a hammer at the blacksmith's, the creak of wagon wheels. Folks turned to stare as the 3 of them rode in, Claire sitting straight in the saddle, the boy before her, his head resting against her chest. They passed the Silver Spur Saloon. The roof where she'd hung in the storm was empty now, but the memory of that night was fresh in every eye. Watching from the boardwalk, old Nate stepped out from the saloon doorway, his dishcloth slung over one shoulder. He gave Zeke a slow nod respect, maybe, or just recognition that the mountain man had gone and done what no one else had the stomach for. The sheriff appeared from his office, jaw working on a piece of jerky. His gaze flicked from Claire to the boy to Zeke. "You've stirred yourself a mess, Harrow," he said. "Barry won't take this kindly." Zeke swung down from his saddle, tightening the cinch before speaking. "Barry's got 5 fewer men than it did 3 days ago. If they're smart, he'll leave it there." The sheriff's eyes narrowed, but he didn't push it. Some men knew when the tide had shifted, and this morning the street's quiet told its own story. Claire slid down from her horse, lifting her boy into her arms. She turned to face the small crowd that had gathered, her voice steady. "I came here with nothing but my name. Some of you watched when they tried to take even that from me. Well, they didn't. No one spoke." But Zeke noticed how a few of the men glanced away, shamefaced, and how others, mostly women, met her eyes with something harder than pity. When Claire turned back to him, Her expression softened. "You could stay," she said. "There's land near the river. Good for trapping. Good for quiet." Zeke looked past her, toward the high country. The peaks rose sharp and cold in the distance, dusted with early snow. "Some folks live where they're born," he said. "Some live where they're needed." Claire studied him for a long moment, then smiled faintly. "And where's that for you?" He adjusted his hat, the brim shadowing his eyes. "Up there for now. But maybe the trail brings me back through." The boy reached out a hand toward Zeke. The mountain man clasped it gently, his calloused fingers swallowing the child's small palm. Then he turned and mounted, the creak of saddle leather loud in the morning stillness. As he rode out, the wind picked up, carrying the smell of rain over dust. Red Mesa shrank behind him, the sound of the town fading into the whisper of the plains. Somewhere out there, trouble would be brewing again. It always was. But for now, there was open country ahead, and a man like Zeke Harrow didn't need more than that dot by sundown. He was a dark shape against the foothills, and then he was gone.